Hey guys, welcome back. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome to what I hope becomes your new favorite way to fall asleep. No judgment. That's literally the point, so go ahead. Dim the lights. Pull the blankets up. Get that pillow situated just right, you know, the cold side. Close your eyes if you want. Or don't. You can stare at the ceiling. You can let your phone rest face down on your chest. Whatever works. Because tonight, we're going somewhere old. Like, really old. Like, before the pyramids were even a twinkle in some pharaoh's eye old. Tonight, we're going all the way back. To the very beginning. Or at least, to what the ancient Sumerians believed was the beginning. We're talking about Sumer, the land between two rivers. The place where, depending on who you ask, civilization itself decided to wake up one morning, stretch its arms, and start writing things down on clay tablets. And oh, did they write things down? They wrote down everything. Grain shipments, legal disputes, beer recipes, and, most importantly for us tonight, they wrote down their creation myths. Their origin stories. Their deeply weird, deeply fascinating explanations for how the world came to be, how the gods behaved, spoiler, badly, and how humanity ended up here, doing whatever it is we're doing, which right now, for you, is falling asleep. And that's fine. That's perfect, actually. So, let's start at the very beginning. Not the Sumerian beginning, we'll get there, but the geographical beginning. Because to understand the Sumerians, you have to understand the land they lived on. And the land they lived on was, honestly, kind of terrible. Southern Mesopotamia. Modern-day southern Iraq. A flat, hot, sun-baked stretch of earth, wedged between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. If you've ever looked at a map of the Middle East and noticed that little sliver of green between two blue lines snaking down toward the Persian Gulf, that's it. That's where it all started. The Greeks later called it Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between the rivers. Because the Greeks were nothing if not straightforwardly descriptive when they wanted to be. Now, this land, this hot, swampy, insect-ridden land was not an obvious candidate for the birthplace of civilization. It didn't have forests full of timber. It didn't have mountains full of metal, or it didn't even have much stone. What it had was mud. Lots and lots of mud. And reeds. And the occasional date palm standing there looking vaguely optimistic. That was about it. But it also had those two rivers. And those rivers flooded. And when they flooded, they left behind rich, fertile silt. And if you were clever enough, and the Sumerians were very, very clever, you could figure out how to channel that water, irrigate that silt, and grow enough barley and wheat to feed a whole lot of people. And when you can feed a whole lot of people, well, things start to happen. People settle down. They build houses. They build temples. They argue about property lines. They invent bureaucracy. They invent beer. Honestly, the buyer might have come first. There's a real academic debate about whether humans first started farming grain to make bread or to make beer. And if you know anything about humans, you probably already know which one sounds more likely, so there they were. The Sumerians, sometime around 4500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, because when you're dealing with dates this old, a few centuries is basically a rounding error. People started clustering together in southern Mesopotamia. They built small settlements, then bigger settlements. Then, eventually, actual cities. Cities like Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves considered the oldest city in the world. The first city. The place where kingship, that divine, sacred, slightly terrifying concept, first descended from heaven. And that phrase, descended from heaven, is going to come up a lot tonight. Because the Sumerians didn't think of their civilization as something they built on their own. They didn't pat themselves on the back and say, "Look what we did with some mud and a can-do attitude." No, they believed that everything, kingship, law, agriculture, writing, brewing, weaving, even the proper way to conduct a funeral, all of it was a gift from the gods. Handed down from above, bestowed upon humanity by divine beings who lived in a realm far beyond the dusty plains of Summer, and the most important of those divine beings, the ones who supposedly shaped the world, organized the cosmos, and in some versions of the story, literally molded humans out of clay, like some kind of cosmic arts and crafts project. Those were the Anunnaki, but we're not going to talk about the Anunnaki just yet. No. We're going to do this properly. We're going to start before them. Before the gods got organized. Before the heavens and the earth were separated. Before there were humans to complain about the heat and the mosquitoes, and the fact that their neighbor's goat keeps eating their barley. We're going to start at the very beginning. When there was nothing. Or, more accurately, when there was something but nobody had bothered to name it yet. Let's talk about the Sumerian creation myth. The real one? The one carved into clay tablets thousands of years ago by scribes who probably had no idea that one day, someone would be reading their words aloud to help strangers on the internet fall asleep. But here we are. And honestly, I think those scribes would be fine with it. They seem like they had a good sense of humor. Some of those tablets are surprisingly funny. But we'll get to that. For now, let's settle in. Let's breathe. And let's go back about 6,000 years to a time when the world was young, the rivers were wild, and the gods were about to make some very questionable decisions. The Sumerians didn't have one single unified creation story the way some later traditions did. They didn't have a Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, neat and tidy. What they had was more like a patchwork. A collection of myths, poems, hymns, and narratives that were composed over centuries, in different cities, by different scribes, for different purposes. Some were meant to be recited in temples. Some were meant to explain why a particular god deserved more offerings than another particular god. Some were, frankly, theological propaganda. Our city's god is better than your city's god. And here's a 12-tablet poem to prove it. But when you stitch all these fragments together, and scholars have been doing exactly that for about 150 years now. Ever since the first cuneiform tablets started being dug out of the Iraqi desert, a picture emerges. A cosmology. A worldview. A story about how everything began, and it begins, as so many good stories do. With water. In the beginning, and I mean the very beginning. Before there was a before, there was Nammu. Some texts call her the primeval sea, others describe her as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth. She is the oldest thing. The first thing, the watery, formless, boundless abyss, from which everything else eventually emerged. If you're familiar with other ancient creation myths, the Egyptian Nun, the biblical Tem, the Greek chaos, then Nammu is in that same family. She's the primordial soup. The original nothing that was also everything. And Nammu, this vast and ancient cosmic ocean, existed alone. For how long? The texts don't say. Maybe forever. Maybe for just a moment. Time didn't really exist yet, so the question doesn't quite make sense. She just was. And then, from Nammu, something happened. Something separated. Something divided. The way a bubble rises to the surface of still water. The way cream separates from milk if you leave it long enough. From the formless, undifferentiated waters of Nammu, two things emerged. An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. An and Ki, heaven and earth, the two fundamental halves of the Sumerian cosmos. And in the beginning, they were pressed together. Locked in an embrace. Sky lying flat against earth. Earth pressed up against sky, with no space between them. No air, no light. No room for anything to exist. Just this tight, closed, claustrophobic union of above and below, which is a lovely metaphor, if you think about it. The universe, in its earliest state, was like a closed book. Pages pressed together, stories waiting to be told but with no space yet to tell them, and it stayed that way for a while. The texts are vague on how long. Could have been an age. Could have been an instant. But eventually, something needed to change. Because a universe with no space in it isn't much of a universe at all, and that's where the next generation comes in. Because An and Ki, sky and earth, pressed together in their primordial embrace, they had a son. And that son's name was Enlil. Enlil, remember that name. Write it on your mental chalkboard. Underline it twice. Because Enlil is going to be very, very important. He's one of the most powerful gods in the entire Sumerian pantheon. He's the Lord of the Wind, the Lord of the Air, the Lord of the Storm. He's the god who, in many versions of the myth, would later lead the Anunnaki. He's the one who made the big decisions. The CEO of the divine boardroom, if you will. But before he could do any of that, he had to do one thing first. One really important thing. He had to separate his parents. So here's young Enlil, or, well, young in the sense that he's the next generation. He's probably not young in any way we'd understand. He's a cosmic deity, born from the union of heaven and earth. He doesn't have a birthday cake. He doesn't have baby photos. He just exists. And he exists in this cramped, lightless space between his father, An, the sky, and his mother, Ki, the earth. And what does Enlil do? He does what any self-respecting god of air and wind would do. He pushes. He expands. He forces his way between his parents, separating sky from earth, pushing an upward and Ki downward, creating the space between. The atmosphere, the air, the breath of the world. This is one of the most foundational moments in Sumerian cosmology. The separation of heaven and earth. The creation of the space in which everything else can happen. Before Enlil, there was no room. After Enlil, there was sky above and ground below, and a whole lot of space in between where cities could be built, and rivers could flow, and humans could eventually wander around looking confused. Now, if you're thinking, wait, this sounds a lot like other myths I've heard, you're absolutely right. The Egyptians had Shu separating Geb and Nut. The Mari have Teen separating Ranjanui and Papatrunaku. The Greeks had the Titans overthrowing Uranus. Cultures all over the world, completely independently of one another, came up with this same basic idea. In the beginning, sky and earth were together, and something had to pull them apart. It's one of those universal human intuitions that makes you go, huh, maybe there's something fundamentally human about looking up at the sky and thinking, that used to be closer. But back to Sumer. So Enlil separates heaven and earth, and takes the sky. Ki, or, in some versions, Enlil himself takes the earth. And now there's a world. A world with space. A world with air. A world where things can happen. But it's still pretty empty. There's no sun yet. No moon, no stars. No rivers. Well, the rivers are there in potential. Because the Tigris and Euphrates had a kind of divine origin story of their own, but we'll get to that. There are no plants. No animals. No people, just a dark, quiet, freshly separated cosmos. Sitting there like a newly built house with no furniture. And this is where the Sumerian creation story starts to get really interesting. Because the next part isn't about big, dramatic cosmic events. It's about organization. It's about the gods, slowly, methodically, almost bureaucratically, setting things up. Putting things in order. Assigning roles. Creating systems. And honestly, that feels very Sumerian. Because if there's one thing the Sumerians loved, it was organization. They invented writing largely to keep track of temple inventories. Their entire civilization ran on meticulous record-keeping. So of course their creation myth isn't just, and then everything exploded into existence. It's more like, and then the gods sat down and made a very detailed plan. And assigned each deity a specific responsibility. And created a hierarchical management structure for the cosmos. It's the most beautifully bureaucratic creation story in human history. So let's talk about the gods. The Sumerian pantheon. Because before we can understand what the Anunnaki were and what they supposedly changed, We need to understand the divine family they belonged to. At the very top, you have An, sometimes written as Anu in the later Akkadian texts. An is the Sky Father, the supreme god, the king of the gods, at least in theory. He lives up in the heavens, far removed from the earthly realm, and honestly, he's a bit of an absentee father figure. He has the title, he has the prestige, but in most of the actual myths, he doesn't do a whole lot. He's like the chairman of the board who shows up to the annual meeting, nods approvingly, and then goes back to his corner office and closes the door. The real work is done by others, and the most important of those others is Enlil, god of wind, air, and storms. Enlil is the one who actually runs things on a day-to-day basis. He's the chief executive deity, the one who decrees fates, the one who decides which cities flourish and which cities get wiped off the map. He's powerful, he's authoritative, and he's, let's be honest, kind of a jerk sometimes. There are several myths where Enlil does things that are, by any modern standard, deeply questionable. But we'll get to those. Then there's Enki. And if Enlil is the stern, authoritative CEO type, Enki is the clever, creative, slightly mischievous one. Enki is the god of water, specifically fresh water, the sweet water that flows underground and feeds the rivers and the marshes. He's also the god of wisdom, of crafts, of magic, of knowledge. He's the problem solver, the innovator, the one who, when the other gods create a mess, and they create a lot of messes, figures out a solution. Enki is, frankly, the most likable god in the Sumerian pantheon. He's clever without being cruel. He's powerful without being overbearing. He genuinely seems to care about humanity, which is more than you can say for most of the other gods. In later myths, when Enlil decides to destroy humanity with a flood, because of course he does, it's Enki who sneaks around behind his back and warns a human to build a boat. Sound familiar? It should. That story is old. Really, really old. Way older than Noah, way older than the Bible. It starts right here, in Sumer, with Enki being the one god who thought, maybe we shouldn't kill everyone. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the early days. The world has just been separated. The gods are just getting organized. And there's a fourth major deity we need to meet, Ninhursag, the great mother goddess. The Lady of the Mountains. She goes by several names in different texts, Ninmah, Nintu, Damgalnuna, because the Sumerians had a habit of giving their gods multiple names depending on the context, the city, and apparently their mood. Ninhursag is the goddess of fertility, of birth, of the earth itself. She's the one who, in several creation myths, plays a central role in the actual physical creation of human beings. She's the sculptor, the potter, the one who shapes the clay. These for an Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, are sometimes called the four creating gods, or the four most important deities of the Sumerian pantheon. They form the inner circle, the executive committee, the ones who make the big decisions about how the universe is going to work. But they're far from alone. The Sumerian pantheon was enormous. There were hundreds of gods, maybe thousands, depending on how you count. Every city had its patron deity. Every river, every mountain, every natural phenomenon had a divine being associated with it. The moon was Nana, the sun was Utu Venus, the morning and evening star was Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who is arguably the most fascinating and complex deity in the entire Sumerian tradition, and who absolutely deserves her own video. But I'll try to restrain myself tonight. The point is, the Sumerian cosmos was crowded. It was busy. It was full of divine beings, with overlapping jurisdictions, competing interests, and deeply complicated family relationships. It was, in many ways, a reflection of Sumerian society itself, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and constantly negotiating who got to be in charge of what. And now, somewhere in this early period, after the separation of heaven and earth, but before the creation of humans, we get to the Anunnaki. But let's not rush. Let's take a breath. Let's let the world sit in its newly separated state for a moment. The sky is up. The earth is down. The air is between them. The gods are beginning to stir. And somewhere in the darkness, things are about to get very, very interesting. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. We're in no hurry. The Sumerians weren't in a hurry either. They had a saying, carved into one of their tablets: haste is from the devil. Or something very close to that. They understood that good things take time. And tonight, we have plenty of it. So let's talk about what the world was like before the Anunnaki organized it. Before the great gods divided up their responsibilities. Before the cosmic bureaucracy was put in place, the Sumerian texts describe a primordial world that was, in a word, unfinished. The earth existed, but it was barren. The rivers flowed, but they had no channels, no direction. The marshes spread endlessly with no boundaries. There was no agriculture, no irrigation, no carefully maintained canal systems, which, for the Sumerians, was basically the definition of chaos. To a Sumerian, a world without irrigation was like a world without gravity. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was fundamentally wrong, and there was no light from the heavens as we know it. Nammu, the moon god, hadn't yet taken his place in the night sky. Utu, the sun god, hadn't yet begun his daily journey across the heavens. The stars hadn't been fixed in their positions. The calendar hadn't been established. Time, in the organized, predictable sense, didn't really exist yet. It was a world of potential. Of raw material, like a canvas that had been stretched and primed but not yet painted. Everything was there in possibility, but nothing had been actualized. Nothing had been named, and in Sumerian thought, naming was everything. A thing that had no name didn't fully exist. It was just a shadow. A suggestion. A whisper, asterisk, and this idea that the world began as an unnamed, unorganized, formless possibility, is one of the most beautiful concepts in Sumerian theology. It suggests that creation wasn't just about making things. It was about ordering things, categorizing things, giving things their proper names and their proper places. Creation, for the Sumerians, was an act of cosmic housekeeping. Which, again, feels very on brand for a civilization that invented filing systems. Asterisk now. Here's where we need to introduce one of the most important concepts in all of Sumerian thought. And it's a concept that doesn't have a perfect English translation. Which means I'm going to do my best, and you're going to nod along even though you're probably half asleep. Which is fine. The concept will soak in anyway. Think of it like a warm bath for your subconscious. The concept is called the me. Pronounced may. Not me as in me, myself, and I may. Like the month. Like the word you say when someone asks if you want more dessert. May the me are, well, they're everything. They are the divine decrees. The fundamental principles. The cosmic laws and powers that govern every aspect of reality. They are the blueprints of civilization. The source code of the universe. Every skill, every institution, every social norm, every craft, every art, every aspect of human and divine existence has a corresponding me. There's a me for kingship. A me for priesthood. A me for truth. A me for falsehood. Yes, falsehood has its own divine decree, because the Sumerians were realists. There's a me for music. A me for a me for sexual intercourse. A me for the kindling of fire. A me for the art of being a scribe. A me for the craft of the leatherwork. There are dozens, maybe hundreds. One text lists over 100 of them, and scholars believe the list was probably not even complete. The me are not physical objects, exactly. But they're not purely abstract either. In some myths, they can be carried. They can be stolen. They can be given as gifts. In one famous myth, the one where Inanna gets Enki drunk and convinces him to hand over all the me to her city, they're loaded onto a boat and physically transported down a river, which is either a metaphor or the most important cargo shipment in mythological history, possibly both. The point is this. The me represent the idea that the universe operates according to a set of divine principles. That everything has its proper place, its proper function, its proper order. And this order didn't just happen. It was established. It was decreed. It was designed by the gods. And this is crucial for understanding the Sumerian creation myth. Because in Sumerian thought, creation wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a big bang. It wasn't let there be light, and then light. It was a process. A long, ongoing, collaborative process in which the gods gradually organized the cosmos, established the me, assigned responsibilities, and put everything in its proper place. Think of it like building a city. You don't just snap your fingers and have a city. First, you need to lay out the streets. Then you need to build the houses. Then you need to dig the canals. Then you need to establish the temples. Then you need to appoint the priests. Then you need to set up the markets. Then you need to write the laws. Then you need to hire the scribes to write down the laws. Then you need to train the scribes. Then you need to fire the scribe who keeps making mistakes and hire a better one. It's a process. It takes time. It takes planning. And the Sumerians saw the creation of the world in exactly the same way. The gods were builders, planners, administrators. They were the original project managers. And the me were their blueprints. Now, here's where the Anunnaki start to come into the picture. But softly, gently, like a breeze. The term Anunnaki shows up in Sumerian texts to refer to a group of gods. Not a specific god, but a group, a collective. The word itself is a bit debated. It might mean those of princely seed, or those who came from heaven to earth, or something else entirely, depending on which scholar you ask and how much coffee they've had that day. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki are simply the gods of the earth. The underworld gods, the chthonic deities, as opposed to the Agigi, who are the gods of the sky. It's a division of labor. Anunnaki below, Agigi above. The ones who work the earth and the underworld versus the ones who manage the heavens. But over time, and this is important, the meaning of Anunnaki shifted. In later texts, especially the Babylonian ones, the Anunnaki became something grander. They became the great gods, the judges, the decreers of fate. The ones who sat in council and made decisions about the destiny of the world. And in the creation myths, the Anunnaki play a very specific and very interesting role. They're the workforce, the laborers, the ones who, before humans existed, had to do all the work of maintaining the cosmos themselves. Yes, you heard that right. Before humans, the gods had to do manual labor. And they were not happy about it. This is one of my favorite parts of Sumerian mythology, because it's so deeply, absurdly relatable. The gods, these all-powerful, immortal, cosmic beings were complaining about having to work. They were tired. They were grumpy. They were, essentially, on the verge of a divine labor strike, and this, according to the Sumerian creation myths, is why humans were created. Not out of love. Not out of a desire for companionship. Not because the gods wanted someone to worship them though. That became part of it. No. Humans were created because the gods were tired of digging canals. I'm not even exaggerating. That's literally what the texts say. The Anunnaki were toiling away, maintaining the irrigation systems of the divine realm, and they got fed up. They complained. They protested. And the senior gods, Enki and Ninhursag, primarily came up with a solution. They would create a new being. A worker, a servant. Something that could take over the manual labor so the gods could relax, and that new being was humanity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. We're still in the time before that happened. The time when the world was fresh and new and the gods were still working out the kinks. The time before the Anunnaki's complaint. Before the creation of humans. Before everything changed, so let's linger here for a moment. In this quiet, pre-human world. A world of gods and water and empty plains and unnamed things. waiting to be called into existence. There's a text fragmentary, as so many of them are known as the Eridu Genesis. It's one of the oldest creation narratives we have. Not just from Sumer, from anywhere. And it describes this early world in terms that are almost poetic in their simplicity. In those days there was no snake. There was no scorpion. There was no hyena. There was no lion. There was no dog. There was no wolf. There was no fear. There was no terror. Humans had no rival. That's from the text. Or at least, from the best translation we have of the surviving fragments. And it describes a kind of paradise. A golden age. A time when the world was peaceful and gentle, and nothing was trying to eat anything else. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds like the Garden of Eden, you're right. It does. And many scholars have noted the parallels. The Eridu Genesis, which dates to roughly 1600 BCE in its written form but probably draws on oral traditions much older than that, contains themes that would later show up in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek mythology, in traditions across the ancient Near East, the idea of a primordial paradise, the idea of a golden age, the idea that things were once perfect and then, somehow, went wrong. And in the Sumerian version, what went wrong was, well, it's complicated. It wasn't a single act of disobedience, like eating a forbidden fruit. It was more gradual, more structural. The world got more complex. The gods got more numerous. Their needs grew. Their labor increased. And eventually, something had to give. But in that early time, before the complexity, before the labor disputes, before the creation of humanity, in that early time, the world was simple. And the gods were free. And the rivers flowed where they pleased, unchanneled and unchained, spreading out across the flat Mesopotamian plain like a sleepy traveler sprawling across a bed. Which is exactly what you should be doing right now, sprawling, relaxing, letting the weight of your body sink into whatever surface is supporting you. Because we've got a long way to go, and the next part of this story is going to require you to be very, very comfortable. Let's float gently over to one of the most important places in Sumerian cosmology. A place that existed before the earth was fully formed. Before the gods had organized themselves into their neat little hierarchy. Before the Anunnaki started grumbling about their workload, the Abzu sometimes spelled Abs, especially in the later Babylonian texts, is the primordial freshwater ocean. It exists beneath the earth. Imagine, if you will, the entire surface of the world floating on top of an infinite reservoir of sweet, pure, fresh water. Not salty ocean water. Not muddy river water. Clean, clear, underground water. The water that feeds springs and wells and bubbles up from the ground in unexpected places. The Abzu was Enki's domain. His home, his kingdom. And understanding the Abzu is key to understanding both Enki and the entire Sumerian worldview. See. The Sumerians lived in a land where water was everything. Too little water, and your crops died, and your family starved. Too much water, and the rivers flooded and washed everything away. The difference between prosperity and catastrophe was water management, irrigation, canals, dikes, reservoirs. The entire Sumerian economy, the entire Sumerian civilization was built on the ability to control water, so of course they imagined a god of water. And of course that god was one of the most important deities in their pantheon. And of course his domain was a vast, underground ocean of pure fresh water. Because that's what they needed. That's what they depended on. That's what they dreamed about. Enki sitting in his Abzu was the god who made the rivers flow. He was the god who filled the marshes. He was the god who ensured that the underground water table remained full, that the wells didn't run dry, that the springs kept bubbling. He was, in the most literal sense, the god who kept Sumer alive. But Enki wasn't just a water god. He was a wisdom god, a trickster god, a god of cunning and creativity and invention. And this combination, water and wisdom, isn't random. In Sumerian thought, water and wisdom were deeply connected. Both were seen as flowing, adapting, finding their way around obstacles. Both were seen as life-giving. Both were seen as essential for civilization. You couldn't have a functioning society without water, and you couldn't have a functioning society without knowledge. Enki embodied both. There's a wonderful myth called Enki and the World Order, sometimes translated as Enki and the Ordering of the World, that describes how Enki went about organizing the cosmos. And it's essentially a divine Enki travels from place to place, from river to river, from city to city, and at each stop, he decrees something. He assigns a purpose. He establishes an order. He goes to the Tigris and fills it with water. He goes to the Euphrates and does the same. He goes to the marshes and fills them with fish and reeds. He goes to the sea and establishes the trade routes. He visits the farmland and blesses it with grain. He visits the brick mold and establishes construction. He visits the plow and establishes agriculture. On and on, item by item, element by element, like a divine inspector checking off a very long list, and at each stop, he doesn't just create the thing. He assigns a god to be in charge of it. The river gets a river god. The grain gets a grain goddess. The brick mold gets a brick god. Everything gets its own divine supervisor. It's delegation. It's middle management. It's the cosmos being organized into departments, each with its own department head, all reporting up to the executive team of an Enlil Enki, and Ninhursag. That this is the world before the Anunnaki changed things. Or more accurately, this is the world the Anunnaki were building. Because the Anunnaki in these early texts aren't aliens or outsiders or mysterious visitors from another planet, despite what certain History Channel documentaries might want you to believe. They're gods. Sumerian gods. Members of the divine family. They're the rank and file. The workers. The ones who carry out the decrees of the senior gods, and they were busy. The myth of Atrahasis, which is technically Babylonian, dating to around 1700 BC, but draws heavily on earlier Sumerian traditions, gives us the most detailed picture of what the Anunnaki were doing before humans came along. And what they were doing was work. Hard, physical, backbreaking, monotonous work. They were digging the riverbeds. They were clearing the canals. They were maintaining the waterways that kept the divine realm functioning. They were, essentially, the cosmic labor force. The construction crew. The maintenance team. And they did this for a long, long time. The text says they worked for 40 years. Or maybe it was thousands of years. The numbers in these texts are often symbolic rather than literal. And when a Sumerian text says 40, it might mean a whole lot. And here's the thing, they hated it. They really, really hated it. The Atrahasis text describes the Anunnaki's growing resentment in vivid terms. They're exhausted. They're bitter. They're angry. The work is too hard. The hours are too long. And nobody seems to care. The senior gods, the executives, the corner office deities, they're not digging canals. They're sitting up in heaven making decrees and looking important. Meanwhile, the Anunnaki are down in the mud, literally, shoveling and hauling and sweating and suffering. It's a labor dispute. A divine labor dispute. The first strike in recorded mythology. And what do the Anunnaki do? They rebel. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's temple. They surround his house in the middle of the night, like an angry mob with torches, except divine. So probably more impressive and terrifying, Enlil, to his credit, is alarmed. He doesn't know what to do. He calls an emergency meeting of the senior gods. The Anunnaki are revolting, he says. Which, depending on your reading, could be either a statement of fact or an insult. And this is the moment. This is the turning point. This is where the world changes. Because the solution to the Anunnaki's labor problem, the solution that Enki and Ninhursag come up with, is going to alter the course of cosmic history. But we'll get to that. We will absolutely get to that. First, let's just sit with the image for a moment. The gods, tired and angry, standing outside Enlil's temple in the dark. The senior gods, alarmed and confused, trying to figure out what to do. The cosmos, still young and disorganized, teetering on the edge of a crisis. It's a very human scene, isn't it? For a story about gods. Very, very human. Take a breath. Let that settle. We're about halfway through the night, and the best parts are still coming. The creation of humanity. The Great Flood. The aftermath. The world the Anunnaki built and the world they changed. But for now, let's rest. The gods are resting too. Even divine beings need a break sometimes. All right, so, the Anunnaki have gone on strike. They've burned their tools. They've surrounded Enlil's house. They're standing there in the divine darkness, arms crossed, looking very much like a group of construction workers who have just been told that their lunch break has been cancelled for the third time this week, and the great Lord of Wind and Storms and executive decision-making is panicking because he needs the Anunnaki to work. Without them, the canals don't get dug. The rivers don't get managed. The cosmic infrastructure falls apart. And you can't exactly fire the gods. Where would you even post the job listing? So he calls a meeting. And at this meeting, Enki, clever, resourceful, always has an idea. Enki proposes something radical. Let's make something, he says. Or words to that effect. The exact phrasing varies depending on the text and the translation. But the gist is this. Let's create a new being. A worker. Something that can take over the manual labor. Something that can dig the canals and plow the fields and carry the loads so that the Anunnaki don't have to anymore. And Ninur, the mother goddess, the great shaper, the divine potter, agrees to help. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. And a little strange. And maybe a little dark, depending on your perspective. Because the creation of humanity, in the Sumerian tradition, is not a gentle, loving act. It's not a tender scene of a caring God breathing life into a beloved creation. It's more like a manufacturing process. A solution to a labor shortage. Humanity is created not out of love, but out of necessity. Not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. And the raw materials. Oh, the raw materials are something. In the Atrahasis version. The gods decide that to create humans, they need two things, clay and divine blood. The clay is straightforward enough, Mesopotamia had plenty of it. And the idea of shaping beings from clay is one of the most universal creation motifs in human mythology. But the blood is where things get dark. The gods select one of their own, a god named Wilu or Geshtui. Depending on the text, a god described as having intelligence or understanding. And they kill him. They slaughter him. And they mix his blood and his flesh with the clay. Yes, humanity was created from a mixture of divine blood and earthly clay. We are, according to the Sumerians, part God and part dirt. Which honestly explains a lot about the human condition, if you think about it. We have these grand aspirations, these moments of brilliance and creativity and transcendence. That's the divine blood. And we also have an irresistible urge to sit on the couch and eat chips for 6 hours straight. That's the clay. The choice of a god with intelligence is significant. By the way, it's not random. The Sumerians believed that the reason humans have consciousness, the reason we can think and plan and create, is because there's a spark of divine intelligence mixed into our clay. We're not just animated dirt. We're animated dirt with a god's mind stirred in. It's a surprisingly sophisticated theological concept, and it predates most of the world's major philosophical traditions by millennia. So, Enki and Ninhursag mix the clay and the blood, and Ninhursag shapes the first humans. She molds them. She forms them. She brings them into being with her skilled, divine hands. And this is one of my favorite details in all of Sumerian mythology, there's a party. Yes, a party. After creating humanity, the gods celebrate. They have a feast. And they drink beer. Because of course they do. This is Sumer. Everything involves beer, and here's where the story takes a wonderfully weird turn. Because during this party, Enki and Ninhursag get drunk. Really drunk. And in their drunken state, they start making variations. Experimental humans. Unusual humans. Humans with disabilities or differences. The texts describe several of these alternate creations: a person who can't bend their arms, a person who can't hold urine, a person who has no sexual organs, and so on, and it becomes a kind of game between Enki and Ninhursag. She creates a flawed human, and he finds a role for it in society. He creates a flawed human, and she tries to do the same. Back and forth, like a divine game of can you top this? Now, there are a lot of ways to interpret this passage. Some scholars see it as an etiological myth, a story that explains why some people are born with disabilities. The message being that even imperfect humans have a place in society, a role to play, a contribution to make. Others see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of creating things while under the influence. Don't drink and make humans, basically. Either way, it's a fascinating and strangely touching passage. The gods, drunk at a party, playing with the building blocks of humanity. Making mistakes. Finding solutions. Laughing, probably. Being, for a moment, very much like the humans they've just created. But the main point, the important takeaway is this: humanity was created to work, to serve, to take over the labor that the Anunnaki no longer wanted to do. Humans were made to dig the canals, tend the fields, build the temples, and offer sacrifices to the gods. We were, from the very beginning, servants. And this isn't presented as a tragedy in the Sumerian texts. It's not a fall from grace. It's not a punishment. It's just how things are. The gods made the rules. They made us to follow them. Our job is to work the land, maintain the temples, offer food and beer to the divine, and in return, the gods keep the cosmos running. It's a transaction. A cosmic employment contract. You do your part, we do ours, and everybody stays happy. Well, mostly happy. Because, as we'll see, things didn't always stay happy. The gods could be fickle. The gods could be cruel. And sometimes, when humanity got too noisy or too numerous or too annoying, and yes, too noisy is literally cited as a reason in some texts, the gods decided to thin the herd. But we'll get to the flood. We will definitely get to the flood. It's coming. Like a slow wave building on a distant horizon. But not yet. For now, let's just appreciate the picture. Humanity, freshly made, stepping out onto the Mesopotamian plain for the first time. Blinking in the sunlight, assuming the sun has been established by now, which it probably has. Because Enki would have gotten around to that during his cosmic organizing tour. These new beings, made of clay and divine blood, picking up the tools the Anunnaki have just put down, and beginning the long, hard, endless work of civilization. Digging canals, planting barley, building mud brick houses, making beer, always making beer. And they sit back, they rest. They take their places in the temples and wait for the offerings. The divine labor strike is over. The workers have been replaced. The new workforce doesn't complain, or at least, doesn't complain in a way the gods have to listen to, for now. Let's drift forward in time. Not too far, just a little. Just enough for the first cities to start appearing. Like flowers blooming in a desert after rain, slowly, tentatively, but then all at once. The Sumerians believed that cities didn't just evolve naturally. They didn't spring up because people happened to settle in convenient locations. No, cities were established by the gods. Each city was a divine project. A sacred creation. And each city had a patron deity, a god or goddess, who had chosen that particular spot, that particular community, and had invested their divine power and presence in it. Eridu was the first. Or so the Sumerians believed. Eridu, the city of Enki, located in the far south, near the edge of the marshes where the fresh water and the salt water mixed. Archaeological evidence actually supports this. To some extent, Eridu is one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in southern Mesopotamia, with remains dating back to around 5400 BCE, that's over 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years of people living, working, praying, arguing, and making beer in the same spot. After Eridu came other cities: Bad Tibira, Larik, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are the 5 cities mentioned in the Sumerian king list as existing before the Great Flood. The antediluvian cities, the cities of the before-time, and each of these cities had kings. Or rather, each of these cities had kingship. Because in Sumerian thought, kingship wasn't just a political arrangement. It was a divine institution. One of the fundamental principles of cosmic order. Kingship was a gift from the gods, and it was given to specific cities at specific times. And it could be taken away. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, records the names and reign lengths of the kings who ruled these antediluvian cities. And the reign lengths are, well, there's something. Ululam, the first king of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000 years. The kings of Bad Tibira reigned for even longer. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. Enmengalana, 28,800 years. The divine shepherd, Dumuzi, yes. The same Dumuzi who appears in the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, reigned for 36,000 years. These numbers are obviously not literal. No one actually lived for 36,000 years, even in Sumerian mythology. But what do they represent? Scholars have debated this for decades. Some think the numbers are symbolic, representing the great age and prestige of these early kingdoms. Some think they're based on astronomical calculations. The Sumerians were keen observers of the stars, and some of these numbers correspond to various astronomical cycles when you do the math in their base 60 number system. Some think they're just exaggerated, like a fisherman talking about the one that got away, except on a civilizational scale. Whatever the case, the message is clear. The time before the flood was a time of great antiquity. A time when kings ruled for impossibly long periods. A time when the world was closer to the divine, when the boundary between gods and humans was thinner, when everything was larger and older and more mythical than the present day. And then the flood came, and everything changed. But let's not rush to the flood just yet. Let's sit with these antediluvian cities for a while. Let's imagine them. Eridu, with its temple to Enki, the earliest version of which was a tiny one-room mud brick shrine, just a few meters across, like a sacred closet. Over the centuries, it would be rebuilt and expanded again and again, each new temple built directly on top of the ruins of the old one, layer upon layer, like a cake of sacred architecture. By the time the Sumerians were writing their myths, the temple of Enki at Eridu was massive. A ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of mud brick, rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain, like a mountain in a land that had no mountains. The Sumerians called their temples houses of the gods, and they meant it literally. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was the god's actual house. The god lived there in the form of a statue, usually, but also in a more mystical, metaphysical sense. The god's presence inhabited the temple. The god ate there. The priests prepared daily meals and set them before the divine statue. The god slept there. There was often a bed in the inner sanctum. The god received visitors, their other gods, in the form of their statues, carried in procession from their own temples. It was a rich, strange, deeply ritualized world. A world where the boundary between human and divine was porous, where the gods were not distant, abstract concepts but immediate physical presences, living in specific buildings in specific cities, where a farmer walking past the temple of Enki in Eridu might genuinely believe that the god of wisdom was right there, on the other side of that mud brick wall, sitting on his throne, listening to the sounds of the city, smelling the incense, tasting the offerings, and above it all, watching over it all, decreeing the fates and managing the cosmic order, were the Anunnaki, the great gods, the divine council, meeting in their assembly, debating the future of the world, deciding which cities would rise and which would fall, which kings would reign and which would be overthrown. The world before the flood. The world the Anunnaki built and managed was, in Sumerian memory, both a golden age and a flawed one. It was a time of great prosperity and great power, but also a time of growing tension. Because humans, these clan blood servants created to do the gods' work, had a habit of multiplying and growing loud, and being, frankly, annoying. And the gods, or at least some of the gods, were starting to regret the whole thing. Let's float gently over to one of the most important places in Sumerian cosmology. A place that existed before the earth was fully formed. Before the gods had organized themselves into their neat little hierarchy. Before the Anunnaki started grumbling about their workload. The Abzu, sometimes spelled Abs, especially in the later Babylonian texts, is the primordial freshwater ocean. It exists beneath the earth. Imagine, if you will, the entire surface of the world floating on top of an infinite reservoir of sweet, pure, fresh water. Not salty ocean water. Not muddy river water. Clean, clear, underground water. The water that feeds springs and wells and bubbles up from the ground in unexpected places. The Abzu was Enki's domain. His home, his kingdom. And understanding the Abzu is key to understanding both Enki and the entire Sumerian worldview. See. The Sumerians lived in a land where water was everything. Too little water, and your crops died, and your family starved. Too much water, and the rivers flooded and washed everything away. The difference between prosperity and catastrophe was water management, irrigation, canals, dikes, reservoirs. The entire Sumerian economy, the entire Sumerian civilization was built on the ability to control water, so of course they imagined a god of water. And of course that god was one of the most important deities in their pantheon. And of course his domain was a vast, underground ocean of pure fresh water. Because that's what they needed. That's what they depended on. That's what they dreamed about. Enki, sitting in his Abzu, was the god who made the rivers flow. He was the god who filled the marshes. He was the god who ensured that the underground water table remained full, that the wells didn't run dry, that the springs kept bubbling. He was, in the most literal sense, the god who kept Sumer alive. But Enki wasn't just a water god. He was a wisdom god. A trickster god. A god of cunning and creativity and invention. And this combination, water and wisdom, isn't random. In Sumerian thought, water and wisdom were deeply connected. Both were seen as flowing, adapting, finding their way around obstacles. Both were seen as life-giving. Both were seen as essential for civilization. You couldn't have a functioning society without water, and you couldn't have a functioning society without knowledge. Enki embodied both. There's a wonderful myth called Enki and the World Order, sometimes translated as Enki and the Ordering of the World, that describes how Enki went about organizing the cosmos. And it's essentially a divine Enki travels from place to place, from river to river, from city to city, and at each stop, he decrees something. He assigns a purpose. He establishes an order. He goes to the Tigris and fills it with water. He goes to the Euphrates and does the same. He goes to the marshes and fills them with fish and reeds. He goes to the sea and establishes the trade routes. He visits the farmland and blesses it with grain. He visits the brick mold and establishes construction. He visits the plow and establishes agriculture. On and on, item by item, element by element, like a divine inspector checking off a very long list, and at each stop, he doesn't just create the thing. He assigns a god to be in charge of it. The river gets a river god. The grain gets a grain goddess. The brick mold gets a brick god. Everything gets its own divine supervisor. It's delegation. It's middle management. It's the cosmos being organized into departments, each with its own department head, all reporting up to the executive team of an Enlil Enki and Ninhursag. That this is the world before the Anunnaki changed things. Or more accurately, this is the world the Anunnaki were building. Because the Anunnaki in these early texts aren't aliens or outsiders or mysterious visitors from another planet, despite what certain History Channel documentaries might want you to believe. They're gods. Sumerian gods. Members of the divine family. They're the rank and file. The workers. The ones who carry out the decrees of the senior gods. And they were busy. The myth of Atrahasis, which is technically Babylonian, dating to around 1700 BC, but draws heavily on earlier Sumerian traditions, gives us the most detailed picture of what the Anunnaki were doing before humans came along. And what they were doing was work. Hard, physical, backbreaking, monotonous work. They were digging the riverbeds. They were clearing the canals. They were maintaining the waterways that kept the divine realm functioning. They were, essentially, the cosmic labor force. The construction crew. The maintenance team. And they did this for a long, long time. The text says they worked for 40 years. Or maybe it was thousands of years. The numbers in these texts are often symbolic rather than literal. And when a Sumerian text says 40, it might mean a whole lot. And here's the thing, they hated it. They really, really hated it. The Atrahasis text describes the Anunnaki's growing resentment in vivid terms. They're exhausted. They're bitter. They're angry. The work is too hard. The hours are too long. And nobody seems to care. The senior gods, the executives, the corner office deities, they're not digging canals. They're sitting up in heaven making decrees and looking important. Meanwhile, the Anunnaki are down in the mud, literally, shoveling and hauling and sweating and suffering. It's a labor dispute. A divine labor dispute. The first strike in recorded mythology. And what do the Anunnaki do? They rebel. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's temple. They surround his house in the middle of the night, like an angry mob with torches, except divine. So probably more impressive and terrifying, Enlil, to his credit, is alarmed. He doesn't know what to do. He calls an emergency meeting of the senior gods. The Anunnaki are revolting, he says. Which, depending on your reading, could be either a statement of fact or an insult. And this is the moment. This is the turning point. This is where the world changes. Because the solution to the Anunnaki's labor problem, the solution that Enki and Ninhursag come up with, is going to alter the course of cosmic history. But we'll get to that. We will absolutely get to that. First, let's just sit with the image for a moment. The gods, tired and angry, standing outside Enlil's temple in the dark. The senior gods, alarmed and confused, trying to figure out what to do. The cosmos, still young and disorganized, teetering on the edge of a crisis. It's a very human scene, isn't it? For a story about gods. Very, very human. Take a breath. Let that settle. We're about halfway through the night, and the best parts are still coming. The creation of humanity. The Great Flood. The aftermath. The world the Anunnaki built and the world they changed. But for now, let's rest. The gods are resting too. Even divine beings need a break sometimes. So the waters recede. The world emerges, wet and battered and fundamentally changed. And Ziusudra, our flood hero, our ark builder, our survivor, steps out onto dry land and makes an offering to the gods. He burns incense. He sacrifices an ox. And the gods, who have been starving for sacrifices during the entire flood, because when all the humans are dead, There's nobody to feed you. They gather around the offering like flies around a carcass. That's a direct quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh, by the way. Like flies. The gods, starving and desperate, swarming around a barbecue. It's not the most dignified image. But it's honest. And it reveals something important about the Sumerian worldview. The gods needed humans just as much as humans needed the gods. It was a symbiotic relationship, a mutual dependency dressed up in the language of worship and servitude. And after the offering, the gods make a decision. Or rather, they make a series of decisions. The world will be rebuilt. Humanity will continue. But things will be different now. There will be limits, constraints. Mortality will be more firmly established. The impossibly long lifespans of the antediluvian kings will gradually diminish. Death will become a more immediate and present reality. In some versions, the gods also establish new forms of birth control, which sounds absurd. But remember, Enlil's whole complaint was that humans were multiplying too fast. So the gods create categories of women who cannot bear children. They create infant mortality. They create celibate priestesses. All of these, in the Sumerian mind, were not just sad facts of life, but deliberate divine decisions, implemented after the flood to prevent the human population from getting out of hand again. It's dark. It's really dark, actually. But the Sumerians didn't sugarcoat their theology. They didn't pretend the world was fair or that the gods were benevolent. The gods were powerful. The gods were necessary. But the gods were not always kind. And sometimes, the systems they put in place were designed to serve divine interests, not human ones. And this brings us back to the Anunnaki. Because, after the flood, the Anunnaki's role shifts. In the pre-flood world, they were the laborers, the workers, the cosmic construction crew. After the creation of humanity, they became the overseers, the judges, the divine bureaucrats managing the systems that humanity maintained. And after the flood, they became something even more distant, more abstract, more like cosmic administrators operating from behind the scenes. In later Sumerian and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are described as the gods who decree the fates. They sit in divine council and make decisions about the destiny of kings, cities, and nations. They are the judges of the underworld, weighing the deeds of the dead. They are the guarantors of oaths, the enforcers of cosmic law, the ultimate authority behind the authority of earthly kings. The world the Anunnaki changed the world they helped create by going on strike, by forcing the creation of humanity, and then by participating in the decisions that led to the flood and its aftermath. This world was fundamentally shaped by their actions. They didn't just change it once. They changed it repeatedly. Every divine decree, every cosmic reorganization, every decision made in the assembly of the gods was an Anunnaki decision. They were the board of directors of the universe, and every major corporate restructuring passed through them. And the humans. The humans did what they always did. They worked, they built, they wrote, they prayed. They tried to make sense of a world that was beautiful and brutal, and utterly beyond their control. They looked up at the ziggurats and wondered what the gods were thinking. They poured their libations and hoped for good harvests. They told stories to their children about the time before the flood, when kings lived for 30,000 years and the world was younger and closer to the divine, and they wrote it all down. On clay tablets. In cuneiform script. Pressing a reed stylus into soft clay, creating the tiny wedge-shaped marks that thousands of years later, scholars would learn to read. And through those tablets, those fragments, those broken and incomplete records of a vanished world, the Sumerians speak to us still. They tell us about Nammu, the primordial sea, about An and Ki, heaven and earth, locked in their cosmic embrace, about Enlil, the separator, the lord of the wind, about Enki, the clever one, the water god, the friend of humanity, about Ninhursag, the mother, the shaper, the potter of human clay. They tell us about the Anunnaki, tired and rebellious, burning their tools in the divine night. They tell us about the creation of humanity. Mixed from clay and the blood of a slaughtered god. They tell us about the flood, the rising waters, the one boat that survived, and they tell us about what came after. The new world, the shorter lifespans, the firmer boundaries between divine and human. The long, slow decline from a golden age into ordinary history. It's a story of loss, really. Of a world that was once closer to the gods, and gradually drifted away. Of a paradise that was never quite perfect, but was at least more magical than what came after. Of a humanity that was created to serve but learned to think, to feel, to write, to dream. And if you've made it this far, if you're still awake, still listening, still floating somewhere between consciousness and sleep, then I want you to know something. Those ancient Sumerians, sitting in their mud brick houses 6,000 years ago, watching the stars wheel overhead in the hot Mesopotamian night. They were doing exactly what you're doing right now. They were lying in the dark, listening to stories, letting the words carry them somewhere peaceful, somewhere ancient, somewhere far away from the worries of the day, because stories are the oldest technology. Older than writing, older than cities, older than agriculture, older than beer, and that's saying something. Stories are what humans do. What we've always done. And the stories the Sumerians told are the oldest stories we can still read. The oldest voices we can still hear, so listen to them for a little longer. Let their words wash over you like water. Like the waters of the Abzu Enki's underground ocean, cool and deep and timeless. Let's slow down even more now. Let's let the narrative dissolve into something softer. Something more ambient. Like the sound of water flowing through a canal at night. Like the murmur of a priest chanting in a dimly lit temple. Like the scratch of a reed stylus on wet clay. Because I want to tell you about daily life in Sumer, not the grand myths, not the cosmic dramas, just life. Ordinary, everyday, 6,000-year-old life. The cities of Sumer were small by modern standards. Even the biggest, Ur, at its height, probably had a population of around 60 to 80,000 people, which is about the size of a mid-range suburb today. You could walk from one end of the city to the other in less than an hour. You would know your neighbors. You would know their goats. You would definitely know their goats, because the goats would be eating your garden. The houses were made of mud brick. Sun-dried mostly, though fired brick was used for important structures like temples and city walls. The houses were small, clustered together, sharing walls, opening onto narrow lanes and courtyards. They had flat roofs because it almost never rains in southern Iraq, so why bother with a sloped roof? And people would sleep on those roofs in the summer, when the heat inside became unbearable. The temples were the largest buildings in the city. They dominated the skyline such as it was. A ziggurat could be several stories tall, a massive stepped structure of mud brick, rising above the flat plain like an artificial mountain. And that's essentially what it was. In a land without mountains, the Sumerians built their own, because the gods, they believed, lived on mountains. And if you didn't have a natural mountain, you made one. Inside the temple complex, there were courtyards, storerooms, kitchens, workshops, and the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, where the divine statue resided. The statue was not a symbol. It was not a representation. It was, in Sumerian belief, the actual physical body of the god on earth. The god's essence inhabited the statue the way a person's soul inhabits their body. The statue was washed, dressed, fed, and cared for every single day. The priests and priestesses who served in the temple were some of the most important people in Sumerian society. They were the intermediaries between humans and gods. They performed the rituals, maintained the sacred calendar, interpreted omens, and managed the temple's considerable economic assets because temples were not just religious institutions but also major economic centers. They owned land. They employed workers. They managed herds of livestock and warehouses of grain. The temple of a major god was, in many ways, the largest corporation in the city. and the rituals they performed were ancient even by Sumerian standards. Some of them dated back to the very earliest days of settlement, to the tiny one-room shrines of Eridu, 5,000 years before the texts we're reading were composed. Generation after generation of priests, performing the same gestures, speaking the same words, offering the same prayers, in an unbroken chain of worship, stretching back into the mists of Prehert's tour. Is a beautiful thought, isn't it? That chain of continuity. That thread of ritual connecting the present to the deep past. Every time a priest poured a libation of beer before the statue of Enki, they were doing what their predecessors had done for thousands of years. They were maintaining the connection, keeping the channel open between human and divine, doing their part to keep the cosmic machinery running, because that's what the Sumerians believed. The world was a machine, a complex, delicate, interlocking system of divine and human components, and it required constant maintenance. The gods maintained the cosmic aspects, the stars, the seasons, the floods. The humans maintained the earthly aspects, the canals, the fields, the temples. And the rituals were the interface. The point of connection. The place where divine and human met and renewed their ancient compact. Every morning, the priests would open the doors of the inner sanctum and wake the god. They would wash the statue, anoint it with oil, dress it in fine garments, set out a meal, bread, beer, meat, fruit, the finest the temple had to offer. They would burn incense. They would chant hymns. They would perform the precise, choreographed movements that had been passed down through centuries of priestly tradition, and in the evening, they would close the doors, put the god to bed, darken the sanctuary, and the city would grow quiet. The narrow lanes would empty, the rooftops would fill with sleepers, and the stars Nana, the moon, Utu the sun having set, the vast river of the Milky Way arching across the sky. The stars would preside over a city at rest. It's not so different from what you're doing now, is it? Settling in, letting the day close, letting the darkness gather, trusting that the world will still be there in the morning, that the sun will rise, that the rivers will flow, that the ancient, invisible machinery of the cosmos will keep turning while you sleep. The Sumerians trusted that. They had to. Their entire worldview depended on it. The gods would keep their end of the bargain as long as the humans kept theirs. And so the rituals continued. Day after day. Century after century. Millennium after millennium. Until they didn't. But that's another story. That's the story of the fall of Sumer. The story of the Akkadians and the Amorites and the Elamites and all the other peoples who swept through Mesopotamia like waves, each one washing away a little more of the old order. That's the story of how the Sumerian language died slowly, gradually, lingering on as a scholarly and liturgical language long after anyone spoke it in the streets, like Latin in medieval Europe. That's the story of how the cuneiform tablets were buried and forgotten, lying in the desert sand for thousands of years, waiting to be found. But we don't need to tell that story tonight. Tonight, we're in the Golden Age. The before time. The time when the gods were close, and the world was young, and the rivers ran full, and the barley grew tall, and the beer was strong, and the nights were long and quiet. And speaking of long and quiet nights, yours is getting along nicely. You're deep in it now. That warm, heavy, comfortable place where the words are just sounds and the sounds are just rhythms and the rhythms are just waves, carrying you gently toward sleep. So let me tell you one more thing before we wind down. One more piece of the Sumerian puzzle. One more fragment from the clay tablets of the world's first civilization. The Sumerians didn't know they were the first. They didn't think of themselves as pioneers or innovators or the founders of civilization. They thought they were the recipients, the beneficiaries, the grateful servants of gods who had given them everything: writing, agriculture, law, music, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, the art of brewing, the art of weaving, the art of making love, and the art of making war. They believed all of these things were gifts from the divine, cosmic blueprints handed down from heaven. And their job, humanity's job, was to maintain these gifts, to practice them, to perfect them, to pass them on, and they did. Oh, they did. The Sumerians invented, or at least were the first to record so many things that it's almost absurd. Cuneiform writing, the wheel, the plow, the sailboat, the arch in architecture, the mathematical concept of place value. The 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour, that's from their base 60 number system. And we still use it today. Every time you look at a clock, you're reading Sumerian math. They wrote the first known laws, the first known love poetry, the first known lullabies, the first known proverbs. He who possesses much silver may be happy. He who possesses much barley may be happy. But he who has nothing at all can sleep. That's a Sumerian proverb. And it feels like it was written yesterday. They mapped the stars. They tracked the movements of the planets. They developed a lunar calendar. They predicted eclipses. They divided the sky into constellations, some of which we still recognize today. When you look up at the night sky and see the constellation of the Bull, or the Scorpion, or the Great Twins, you're seeing what the Sumerians saw. The same stars, the same patterns, the same ancient, patient light, traveling across the millennia to reach your eyes, and they told stories. The greatest stories. The oldest stories. Stories about gods and humans, about creation and destruction, about love and death, about wisdom and folly. Stories that would be retold and reimagined by every civilization that came after them. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually us. Sitting here in the dark, thousands of years and thousands of miles away, still listening, the story of the Great Flood. The story of the hero's journey to find immortality. The story of the goddess who descended to the underworld and came back changed. The story of the gods who created humanity out of clay and blood and divine cleverness. The story of the world before and the world after. These stories survived because the Sumerians wrote them down, on clay, which, as it turns out, is one of the most durable writing materials in human history. Paper burns. Parchment rots. Papyrus crumbles. But clay lasts. Especially if it's been baked in a fire, which, ironically, is exactly what happened to many cuneiform tablets when the cities that housed them were burned by invaders. The destruction that ended those cities preserved their knowledge for eternity. There's something almost poetic about that. The fire that destroyed the library saved the books. The catastrophe that ended the civilization preserved its voice. And so, 6,000 years later, we can still read what the Sumerians wrote. We can still hear what they thought. We can still enter their world, their strange, beautiful, terrifying, deeply human world, and walk among their gods and kings, and priests and farmers and scribes. And that's what we've been doing tonight. Walking through the Sumerian cosmos, from the primordial waters of Nammu to the separation of heaven and earth, from the organization of the divine order to the rebellion of the Anunnaki, from the creation of humanity to the Great Flood and beyond. Through the temples and the cities and the rituals and the prayers, it's a world that's gone now. Long gone. The cities are dust. The temples are mounds. The rivers have shifted course. The language is silent. But the stories remain, etched in clay, preserved by fire, translated by generations of dedicated scholars, and now, told to you, in the dark, as you drift toward sleep. The Anunnaki changed the world. That's what the Sumerian texts tell us. They changed it by refusing to work, by forcing the creation of humanity, by participating in the decisions that led to the flood and the world that came after. They changed it by being, in many ways, very much like us, tired, frustrated, ambitious, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous, always complicated, and the world they changed. It's still here. We're still in it. Still digging our canals, metaphorical ones, now, but canals nonetheless. Still building our temples. Still telling our stories. Still looking up at the stars and wondering what it all means. The Sumerians didn't have all the answers. They knew that. Their myths are full of uncertainty, of questions without resolutions, of gods who make mistakes and humans who suffer for them. But they asked the questions. The biggest, hardest, most fundamental questions that any civilization can ask. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What was the world like before us? What will it be like after? And they wrote the answers down. On clay. In the world's first writing system. In the world's first cities. In the world's first civilization, and now those answers have found their way to you. Through millennia of time, through layers of translation and interpretation. Through the miracle of survival and the patience of scholarship. Through the quiet intimacy of a voice in the dark telling you stories as you fall asleep. The Sumerians would have understood that. They had a goddess of sleep, you know. Her name was sometimes associated with the word for dream. And dreams, in Sumerian thought, were messages. Communications from the divine realm. Windows into the world beyond the world, where the gods still lived and the great stories still unfolded. So as you drift off tonight, if you haven't already, consider this your dream message, your communication from the distant past. From a time when the world was new and the rivers were wild and the gods walked among their temples in cities of mud and reed. Sleep well. The Anunnaki will keep watch. They've been doing it for 6,000 years. They're not going to stop now, and if you hear, somewhere in the edges of your dreams, the sound of water flowing through an ancient canal, or the murmur of a priest chanting in a language no one has spoken for 5 millennia, or the soft scratch of a reed stylus on wet clay, that's just the Sumerians, still telling their stories, still whispering across the ages, good night.